So there's two things really. I lead package two, which is about farmer decision making in relation to antimicrobial use, and I lead the UK team, which comprises the James Hutton Institute and Cardiff University. We have been doing case studies with farmers across Europe, as well as Mozambique and Vietnam, and we've been talking to them about their antimicrobial use. And what becomes quite apparent early on in the research is that antimicrobial use is rarely something that happens in isolation. It typically happens as part of a broader farm trajectory or even system-wide kind of approach to antimicrobial use. So farmers don't wake up in the morning and think, am I going to use antimicrobials or not? They wake up in the morning to manage their flock or their herd. Right. So they go out to the barn, and that may or may not, when they see the condition of their flock, involve antimicrobial use, depending on what the regulations are in their particular country. It depends on how their infrastructure is set up. It depends on how healthy they've been able to keep their animals through a variety of other means. A lot of antimicrobial use is unconscious in that it's already a part of their system, or it's not. So we have a really interesting case in Sweden, for instance, where farmers see it as stigmatic. So there's a stigma associated with using antimicrobials. And the reason for that, in poultry at least, is that a couple of decades ago, the producers themselves decided that, you know what, we need to reduce our antimicrobial use. And they made a lot of effort to do that. And so at present, actually, they use very few antimicrobials at all. It's also highly regulated by the government. So they need to have a veterinarian come and approve if they're going to use antimicrobials in a specific case or not. So there has to be a very clear need. And farmers actually see that as them having done the job badly, that something's gone wrong, that they need to use antimicrobials. What you see in a country like France, same sector, so looking at poultry, for instance, what you see is that until recently, farmers themselves had a lot of decision-making authority about whether they used antimicrobials or not. And for them, using antimicrobials was very much about treating unhealthy birds. So they wanted to keep their flocks healthy. And so they would treat when they thought that there was a need for it. And as you can imagine, that makes for a lot more use of antimicrobials. This is all wrapped in with the idea of what it is to be a good farmer. So farmers are, well, they're people. And I think most people like to feel like they're good at their jobs. They like to think that I'm a good driver. They like to think I'm a good researcher, or I'm a good clerk, or I'm a good lawyer, or whatever it is that they do. And farmers are no different. So they have standards that they have of themselves in terms of what is their skilled role performance. And so antimicrobial use is typically wrapped up in what it means to take good care of their flocks. And so for farmers that are in a highly regulated environment like Sweden, and for instance, what it means to take good care of their flocks is not to use antimicrobials much, to use other measures to make sure that their birds stay healthy. But for farms in France, and I'm picking on France here, it's also true in Italy and other countries, taking good care of their flocks might actually mean using antimicrobials because they want to keep their birds healthy. So what we need to do then is have a look at how we can intervene in those systems. We've also discovered that some of the biggest causes of change in antimicrobial use actually have nothing to do with antimicrobial use at all, by which I mean that wasn't the primary driver or motivator for making a change. So farmers may make a big change in their antimicrobial use when they get a new member of staff, or actually when they lose a member of staff, because that new member of staff comes in with a different set of skills, for instance. And suddenly we don't need to use antimicrobials the way that we have in the past. Or if you lose a member of staff and suddenly you're short staffed, suddenly you're not keeping as close an eye on your animals, they're more likely to get sick, you're more likely to need antimicrobials. The way that barns are set up, for instance, makes a big difference too in terms of how disease is prevented and spread. So quite often when there's a new barn or shed installed, that comes along with a change in antimicrobial use. So you start to see some really interesting levers then about how you can intervene in this system to make a difference. There's quite a number of things that we've learned. In particular, I'd like to talk about some of the ones that are policy relevant or things that actions we can actually take to reduce antimicrobial use. So this notion of what it is to be a good farmer has some real practical applications in the sense of farmers are actually a bit competitive with each other about what they do, but they can't always tell, particularly if their herds or their flocks are confined indoors, what it is that their neighbors are doing. So benchmarking is something that can be really practical as a solution to help farmers to help themselves to improve what they're doing. So what I mean by benchmarking is enabling farmers to collect data on their herds and share it with each other so they can see just how much in the way of antimicrobials, for instance, are being used, as well as other practices. I doubt anyone would consult a database just to look at antimicrobial use, but they would probably look at a lot of different indexes across the board about how fast your livestock are maturing, how much you're feeding them, how much they're drinking, as well as what you're treating them with. And if you have these benchmarks, then farmers themselves can have a look at, you know what, I'm actually near the bottom of the field, or actually I'm at the top of the field. I'm doing something really well. So they can feel good about themselves when they're doing really well. And if they're not doing so well, they can be encouraged that actually, you know what, it's possible. This isn't just it isn't just the way the industry has to be. There are actually a lot of people who have figured this out. So the system needs to be anonymous to work because farmers don't want to be embarrassed about what they're doing. They'll start falsifying data, and that does no one any good. But benchmarking has a huge amount of potential. So do participatory initiatives. So getting farmers together to talk about what it is to be a good farmer, to come up with strategies for how they can reduce their antimicrobial use, or just have better hygiene for their flocks, better productivity, faster growth. All of these things, if they work together and think of solutions, then they're more likely to be adopted at community level. We can also think about extensifying herds. So this is where actually having fewer animals can be more profitable and more productive. And because it doesn't necessarily need the same level of inputs. In terms of these triggers, there's trigger events that happen to make those major changes in farming trajectory. So we can work around those periods. So encouraging farmers, for instance, to improve their facilities, providing low interest loans or grants, for instance, for new infrastructure can be incredibly powerful because when they change those facilities, then they change the way that they're managing their animals, and antimicrobial use can be a really handy byproduct. Changes to the supply chain. So we're increasingly seeing food processors and grocery stores, supermarket chains, make requirements of farmers in terms of antimicrobial use and other standards of hygiene. So collaborating in that can help us encourage farmers through something that doesn't actually cost the public anything to make a change to the way they manage their businesses. It's also important to bundle antimicrobial messaging within broader education around hygiene and disease prevention. If you badge it as something that's going to help you be a better farmer, for instance, then that can have a lot of effect. I'm also a big fan of intervening in things like succession processes, for instance. So younger people, when they're joining the sector, they quite often want to have an influence on the farm to take it in a bit different directions. So working with young people to identify different positive pathways for the farms that involve less antimicrobial use can be a really positive way forward. There's also something really interesting in our findings around marginalization and marginal practice. So people treat different types of livestock differently depending on how valued they are. So you might get a vet out to see your high value Holstein, for instance, you're a dairy cow that's producing a lot of milk or as part of your breeding stock, so you're passing that on to other farmers. This is a high value individual that gets one-to-one attention. And she might get antimicrobials when she's quite ill because she's worth preserving. But at the other end of the spectrum, you actually have her offspring. So dairy cows, as you're probably aware, they need to keep producing calves on an ongoing basis if they're going to keep lactating. But those calves themselves, unless they're part of a pedigree herd, and even then they pretty much need to be female, they're not really very valued. We've decided as a society that actually we don't want to slaughter those infants at birth, essentially, and so they need to be kept alive for a period of time. But they're really considered byproduct or waste within the sector as a whole because they have so little value. So there's some different things that we can do with that. One is just increasing the value of veal and encouraging people to eat more veal and add value to this otherwise byproduct of the system. Another one is to have a closer look at how these individuals are being managed, that our requirement that they not be killed at birth is actually leading to large groups of them being brought together at a young age and actually absorbing a lot of antimicrobials. And the reason for that is because they're young, they're vulnerable, and they need to be cared for. So reducing the needs to intervene in these situations by reducing the amount that these animals circulate, for instance, would make a big impact on antimicrobial use.